Now that we've got the image model set up, in this section we will implement the routing logic in the new images controller file. This is what dictates what HTTP methods and routes are allowed. We're going to write this controller in a slightly different way. A few students have asked why all of the code we've developed in this course is in one large block rather than separating it out into different functions and files. Well, the answer to that is I've tried to focus more on the principles of teaching the subject of REST, rather than the principles of object-oriented programming in application architecture. If I created multiple files with lots of different functions, then in my opinion it would be a little more difficult for my students to focus specifically on the REST principles. It is up to you as a developer on how you structure your application. I am specifically teaching the principles of REST and how you can implement them using PHP. So in this control I'm going to create some additional functions to separate out the logic for each route, just to show you the principles of how you can start to structure your application. But I won't be doing this for all possible parts that could be moved into its own functions, as I feel it distracts from the subject of this course. But basically, if you think there's a better way of architecting your application, then feel free to do that. So with that being said, I'll open up Atom and we'll start creating the images controller file. So I'll right click, new file, and we'll call it images.php. So this is the images controller file. Create a new PHP file. And we need to include the three files, one for the database, one for the response, and one for the image. So we'll do that now. Require once. The first one is db.php, because that's our database connection. Require once. The next one is our response model, so we'll go up a folder because we need to navigate to the model folder. And then it is response.php, and the next one is finally our image model, so require once model image.php. And like I say at the beginning of this video, we're going to create some helper functions here. So the first function we're going to create that helps us out is a function that builds the response in one line. So previously we've had things like you create the new response, you set the status code, you set the success variable, add any messages and things like that. But we're going to shorten that down to create a helper function for that. Now technically this is the part where you would put this function in a different file, and what you would want to do is actually share this file amongst your other controllers. We're not going to do that because I don't want to get into sort of re-architecting this application that we've got built. I want to focus specifically on REST. But this function here, you would actually put in a different functions file and then include that functions file within all of the different controllers where it's going to be used. You'll sort of see what I mean once we start developing this. So we're going to create a function and we're going to call it send response. And it is going to take some attributes. So the first one is the status code. The next one is success. Next one is message. Now some of these are going to be optional parameters, so I'm just going to default them with null if they're not provided. The next parameter is to cache. Set that as false. And the next one is data, and we'll set that to null. So basically we could send a response with just these two attributes here, and it would default all of the rest if we don't provide any. So the first thing we need to do is set up a new response object. Response, new response. So this is just like what we've obviously done in the task. So if I just quickly navigate to task, you can see here that here's an example. So we're going to create a helper method that sort of does this for us. So if I close task down for the time being, new response, and then the first thing we're going to do is set the status code. So response set HTTP status code, and we're just going to pass in the status code, obviously from the passed in parameter up there. The next one is response and set the success and pass in the success attribute. And the next one we want to do is if we pass in a message, so if message is not null, then we want to add the message to the response and obviously pass in that said message. Otherwise it won't call that function. We don't want to add a null message basically. Obviously we're going to add to cache, so if we're going to cache the response, to cache, tell us if I can spell, and we're just going to pass in the to cache parameter. And the next one is check the data. So if we do an if statement, so if data is not null, then we want to add the data to the response. Set data and set the data here. And finally we need to send and exit. So as you can see, I'm just going to get rid of these white spaces. We've created a helper function here called send response, which will take some arguments and build the response for us. So instead of having all of these lines of code, even though it's very specific and it's good for sort of being able to see exactly what you're doing, we're going to sort of branch it into one sort of method. Okay, so we'll use that later. So for the time being, we're going to just fold this down so we can see where we are. The next function we're going to create is the check authorization status. This is the well, it's exactly the same, to be honest, that we've used in our task. So when we added the authorization script, which checks to see if the access token's valid on all of this, obviously this is going to be used with our images as well, because we want to add authentication to the images. We don't want to be able, for people to access the images for tasks when they don't have access to them tasks. This is another sort of part of the script that you can actually put into a function, put that into a separate file, and then include that in every controller that requires this function. It just saves typing all the logic out again. I'm not going to restructure this task controller because obviously that's sort of, I don't want to re-architect the application at this point, but that's what you would do. What I am going to do though is actually just take a copy of that to save us some time sort of writing it all out, because specifically this section is concentrating more on images. I don't really want to go through this again because we've already done that. So I'm just going to take a copy of that, and then I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it check auth status and return user ID. And we actually need to pass in the database connection here. We'll get onto the database connection shortly. We'll do that in a second. We just want to create these functions. So we're going to pass in the right DB once we actually create the connection. But this is just the sort of function body. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to paste that in there. And you can see, obviously, we've got all of our stuff in there. I'm just going to leave it as it is. The only thing I am going to change is the way that we send responses back. So we're just going to change this slightly because we're going to call this function rather than actually have the response sort of separate. It's just a way to show you how to, how to use this new function that we've created here. So I'm just going to change this slightly. So first of all, we'll add messages here. So I am just going to create a null messages. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to run these same checks to see if we need to sort of add the message. So we're just going to run this same check. So if is not set, and it is server HTTP authorization, then we're going to set the message to access token is missing from the header, and the next thing is else. You can see I've made a spell mistake there, so I'm just going to change that. So else if string len, and then it's server. So basically I'm just refactoring this basically to fit in with what we've done. HTTP authorization is less than 1. So basically that's if it exists, but it hasn't actually got a value. So then we'll add the message access token cannot be blank. Okay, so now we can actually get rid of this because we're going to call this function here instead of all of that. So we will call send response. So we're going to pass in the status code, whether it's a success, and any message. So the status code, we're just going to follow this, is 401. The success would be false, and the message would be the passed in message. And now, because we're doing kind of the send in and exit sort of in the function, as you've seen previously, we don't need to call that anymore. So I'm actually just going to get rid of all of that. And I'll just tidy this space up here. So you can see instead of building the response sort of line by line, we're actually just created a helper method to do that. So I'm just going to quickly pass through this down here to see if we need to change these response. I can see that we do here. So I should be able to, so that's a 401, it's false, and I'm just passing the message in. So actually I should just be able to copy that function header there and replace this whole thing with this. So obviously we're passing in a specific message, so I'm just going to move that message and put it there. So now I can get rid of all of that. So you can see how we've gone down from like 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down to 1 line. So I'm just going to take a copy of that because we're probably going to replace it further down. You can see here, here's another response. So 401, false, and we're just going to take a copy of this message and paste it in there. And we can get rid of all of that and we can have 1 line instead. So I'm just going to carry on doing that for what we've got here. And that error message is user account is currently locked out. Replace that, it's still a 401, success is false. Same with this one. So send response, put it there, 401, false, and we're going to copy that to access token expired. So now we're just cutting down lots of sort of lines actually because we just got a helper function here. And we'll just copy this again because it's the response. And this one is a 500, so we'll change that to a 500. It's false, and I'm just going to copy this message and put it there. And we're going to get rid of all of that. Save that, and obviously now you can see that it's dramatically cut down all of the lines that we've created previously and obviously in the course. So the last thing we need to do to this function is to return the user ID. So because we're in a function now, we're not actually going to have access really to these local variables. So I have to pass out the user ID once we've retrieved it from the database. So where we respond to that is just down here. So just after this, check here. So if it's passed all of this validation, we can now return the returned user ID. So return, and then it is the returned user ID from up there. That's the one that we're returning. So now if we have authenticated, then we get the returned user ID, which we can then use to sort of access the tasks and images that belong to this send user. So now that that script's done, I'm just going to minimize that, sort of fold it up, and fold the send response function up as well. It just tidies it up so you can see where we are now. So we are going to create obviously some extra functions in here to deal with all of the different routes that we're going to be using. The routes that we're going to be creating is the one to get the image attributes. So that'll be /tasks /task ID /images /image ID /attributes. So that will return the attributes in a JSON format. The next route we're going to be developing would be the one that returns the image itself. So that would be /tasks/task ID /images/image ID. So this one will return the image file itself. And the next route we'll be creating is the /tasks/task ID /images. So that's the one that we'll be using to post against. So that's the one that we'll be using to create images against a said task. So we actually have to go through and create these sort of if statements to recognize which route we're actually going to. From that, we'll actually update the htaccess file as well. So the first thing I need to do is obviously connect to the database. So we'll set that up now. So obviously, as following what we did with the tasks, we wrap this in a try and catch. So it's try, and then it'll be write db, and then it's db, and then connect write db, and the read db, and that will be db connect read db. And then obviously if them fail, then we want to catch them. So if we do catch, and then it'll be PDO exception, and then we'll just call it ex, and we'll log this out to the error log. Remember, obviously, when we created the task controller, any database connection errors or any sort of SQL errors, we will log them to the internal error log. So we as system admins and developers can actually see what's going on. We never want to show the user the actual database connection error because it could give up sort of user credentials and things like that. Obviously, I have explained that previously. So we use the function called error log, and we pass in the message. So I'm just going to write connection error, and then we're going to append the error message. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is obviously send a response. So send response, and this is obviously going to be a JSON response. So it's 500 error. It's not going to be successful, and we're going to just pass a generic message called database connection error. Okay, so the first route we need to do is, I'm just going to put a comment here. This will be image attributes. So that's going to be /tasks/task ID /images/image ID /attributes. Okay, so we need to pass in obviously a task ID, an image ID, and obviously check to make sure that they're not null and stuff like that. And obviously we need to check to see if it's got the attributes. So we need to use the array key exists again. So if we do an if statement, so array key exists, and we're checking for task ID within the get global variable. Just want to create some space here, and array key exists for image ID within the global get variable, and array key exists for attributes in the global get variable. Let's get rid of this white space. Then we want to, so the first thing we need to do is obviously get the task ID, get the image ID, and get the attributes from the query string. So this is no different really when we're messed about with sort of getting the task. So we'll get the task ID and stuff like that. So it's very similar. So task ID, and then we're going to use the get, and it'll come in as task ID. The next one is the image ID, and let's do the same. Image ID. And the next one will be attributes, to make sure that exists, to make sure we're on the right route. Attributes, And we just need to perform some simple validation to make sure that, you know, they are numeric. That's been passed in for the task ID and the image ID. So we'll just do that quickly now. So image ID, make sure it's not blank or it's not numeric. So it is numeric. So image ID or the task ID is, if it is blank or if it's not numeric. Oops. So that's task ID. Then if it fails that validation, we'll send a response using our function. And it's going to be a 400 because it's a client error. The sort of client has sort of added some incorrect data in there. It's going to be false. And we're going to say just a generic error message. Image ID or task ID cannot be blank and must be numeric. So if that does pass validation, then we need to check whether the request method is a get or a patch, because generally we won't allow delete on attributes. You'll either override them or you'll delete the entire image itself. But it's completely up to you, depends what you're trying to do. So I'm just going to create the if statements to check to see if it is get. You could use a switch statement here. My preference is, to be honest, is to use if statements. I just find them a bit clearer, to be honest. But that's, you know, that's personal preference. So server request method. So if that is equal to get, else if server request method is equal to patch, oops, I forgot the quotes, or else. And what we're going to do for the else, it's just a 405 for the request methods not found. So we'll send the response back, 405 code, false for success, and the message is request method not allowed. We'll sort of pre-fill these shortly. I'm just concentrating on getting the body sort of set up at the moment. So now that we've got the image attributes root sort of ready, we'll now implement the get image, so specifically the image itself, root now. So what we'll do here is else if, and then we will check for array key exists. And what we're looking for here is just the task ID and the image ID. So for array key exists, task ID, and array key exists for, oops, I forgot to put the get on there. So that's in the get variable. Array key exists for image ID. So this is basically saying if it just contains that, so /tasks /1 /images /5, but not the attribute. So this is just specifically for the image itself. So I will just copy and paste that just so we can see where we are here. I'm just going to put it there. It's just for our reference, this really, so we know what it's for. So the image ID, and then we'll come back to this and put the get in there. And we need to copy these. You can obviously write them out yourself. I'm just going to copy and paste them because we're still retrieving the same things. Then we will do some validation on that as well. So we'll copy this too, just to make sure that they exist and that they're not blank and that they're numeric. So now that we perform the validation on that, it's now down to checking if it's a get or a delete, because we want to be able to get the image itself or delete the image itself. So I'm going to do if server request method, and if that is equal to get, and the next one was, it was delete, wasn't it? So else if server request, oops, spelled wrong again, request method equals delete. And obviously we'll implement that, or else if it's not get or delete, then we will send a response back. Actually, I'm just going to copy that just to save time. So send response 405, request method not allowed. And I guess the last route we need to create is the one that handles creation of an image. So this is where we're just posting to. So I'm just going to put another comment, and it's /tasks/task ID/images. So this one actually won't contain the image ID. So we'll just be checking for the task ID on this one and making sure that the image ID doesn't exist. So we'll start that now. So it's it'll be else if, because we're following on from the branch of the if statement. I'll just make that closer so that's more obvious. So else if array key exists, and we're looking for the task ID within the get variable, and we need to make sure that the image ID doesn't exist. So not array key exists, so obviously where this is false, and we're looking for image ID here within the get variable, and we'll create the body for this. So this is just for posting only, so it won't be, you can't, we're not going to set a route up that will delete every image against a task, although you could, but generally you would get a list of images for a said task and go through them individually and send a sort of delete request to that. So for this route only, we are just accepting post. So first thing we need to do, I guess, is to perform some validation on that, just like we did with the other one. So I'm just going to copy these ones, paste them there, get rid of image ID because we're not containing that, and then obviously deleting the validation on the image ID and changing that task ID cannot be blank, so we must have a task ID passed in. That's basically saying that make sure image ID doesn't exist in the URL, and it doesn't on this case. If we then check to make sure that the request method, so server request method, and that is post, not patch, then obviously we'll carry out that. So else, and we're just going to send a standard error back here for request method not found, not allowed, and we'll save that. So I guess lastly what we need to do is do a catch-all, so else, and then send endpoint not found. So send response, and this is a 404 error, so if none of these URL endpoints or routes exist, then we're just going to send a 404 back, false, and endpoint not found. So that's if all the other routes don't exist, if you try different routes, it doesn't exist. What we need to do now is to alter our htaccess file to obviously take into account these new routes that we're creating. We've left these blank at the minute because we are going to create functions for this. But firstly, what I need to do is actually update the htaccess file. So from here, go into obviously the v1 folder, and we've got htaccess within there. So this is our one that we've already created previously, obviously in this course. So I need to add a new section to this. And we're just going to call it for images, and then obviously it's rewrite rule. Oops, I can't spell. And then it's rule, and then what we're going to be doing is looking for, the first one we're going to look for is obviously /tasks/task ID. So this will be 0 to 9 with a plus, and then end the regular expression. So /tasks/task ID, but first we need to put so this route's going to be /tasks/task ID /images / and then an image ID, obviously also a number between 0, well I guess not between 0 and 9, but contains valid numbers. and then these ones are going to be slash attributes. So we will write here controller, because this is obviously where it maps to, controller slash images.php, task ID equals $1, because that's the one we're encompassing there. And the next one is, so it was image ID, wasn't it? Yep, image ID equals $2, because that's what we're capturing there. And we're going to specifically say that the attributes, so and attributes equals true. And if it does find that, it's the last rule that will process. And I will just put a comment on here to say handle image ID requests for image attributes. Oops, can't spell. Attributes. So that's the get image attributes. The next one we need to write rewrite rule, and then it is, so it'll be tasks, and then task ID again, so 9, and then it'll be images slash and then an image ID, which is 0 to 9 as well. And this maps to, so controller images.php, and this will be task ID equals the 1 and the image ID equals the 2. So obviously put the thing in for the last rule, and just a comment, handle image itself. So that'll return the image itself and not the image attributes. And the last one we need to do is the just slash images to handle the post or the creation request. So rewrite rule tasks slash put it in brackets because we need to take this into the URL itself. So 0 to 9 for the task ID slash images, and then end the regular expression. And this one will be controller slash images.php, and this one will be just task ID. So task ID equals 1 and L, and a quick comment, so handle image request for post. I guess that's fine. So that's our 3 routes actually created in the htaccess rewrite. So that would be slash tasks slash task ID slash images slash image ID. I think I've missed out a plus on there. Make sure you put a plus there. And then slash attributes. So that gets the image attributes. That maps to this query string. And obviously we're checking within the logic of the if statement whether task ID, image ID and attributes exist. The same for this one. So this one will handle slash task slash task ID slash images slash image ID. So this is actually getting the actual image itself. And then obviously the last one is slash task ID slash images. And this one will handle the post request or creation of it. So now that we've created that, we can close the htaccess file down and it takes us back to our image controller. So what we could actually do now is fire up Postman and just making sure we haven't got any syntax errors at the moment. We're not going to really get anything back because we're not actually on, successful requests for the route. We're not actually going to get anything back, but I just want to prove that we haven't got any syntax errors just yet. So if I open up Postman, it'll also prove that our htaccess file is working as well. So http, and then it was localhost port 8888 slash v1 slash tasks slash task ID 1 and then images. So if I send that, we've got an internal server error. So we'll just double check what that error message is. So if we go into Finder, Applications, MAMP, and then we've got a logs file, and then we can open that up And that one there, we have an unexpected curly bracket on line 34. So if we just quickly go back to that in Atom, so line 34, scroll all the way up, and oops, I've closed that accidentally. So line 34, we're missing a semicolon there for both of them. So if we go back to Postman and just send it again, that's fine. Request method not allowed. So that shows that our response is working, because on the /task/task ID/images, that should only be a post. So if we just post that, we're getting to 200. Like I say, it won't do anything at the minute because we haven't actually implemented the functionality of that, but it just proves that our syntax is fine in the file now. If we put in /images/image ID of 1, you can see that we're trying to post to that, but we can't, which is correct. But we should be able to get, that's fine, 200, and also delete. Oops. So that's fine. And if we try and do something like a patch, because we don't patch the image, we'll patch the image attributes, get a 405, which is correct. And then if we write attributes on the end, and if we just get that for the time being, that's fine, because we can get the attributes. We shouldn't be able to post, so that's fine, that's also working. We shouldn't be able to delete, that's also working, but we should be able to patch, so that's fine. So you can see there that actually our logic and syntax is working correctly. Obviously, like I say, it doesn't do anything just yet, but in the next set of videos, we'll actually be implementing the code that allows us to upload sort of the image files against the task. But in order to do that, we must turn on the check authorization status and return the user ID. I purposely left that out at the minute because I just wanted to check to make sure our file that we created didn't have any errors. It did actually have 2 errors, as you've just seen, but you should be able to sort of enable that now. So before we end this video, we'll just quickly enable that. So what we need to do is just underneath this check auth status and return, if we just minimize these, and you will see just before the implementation here for the different routes, we are wanting to perform that validation check for the user. Obviously it does pass back a user ID, so we're going to store that for future. So if we call that returned user ID, and we'll call this function, so check auth status, and we'll pass in the right DB, remember that's the one we're passing in. Authentication should always be done against the master database. Now, if we try and go back to Postman now, in theory, we should get an authorization error because now that we've enabled the authorization check. So if we just go to Postman and if we just try this patch one. So you can see there now authorization has been turned on for this route. So obviously that'll be left on now because we'll need it to implement all of the different other functionality for the different routes. So I guess that's a good time to sort of stop this video here, ready for the next set.